right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the little banter that you sort of indulged in. We're ready to get started. The conversation we're having today is about the Critical Raw Materials Act. And we are trying to understand what are the implications for the global south, given there are so many moving parts within this act. Some of them are internal, but some of them are external. So before we get started, we have Maria Nyberg, who's the policy officer at DG GROW at the European Commission. And we thought the right way to start is for the Commission to tell us what is this act and what were its objectives and what were its principles, and then we'll go into conversation from there. Maria, thank you so much for joining us. You have the floor.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you hear me well? All is good?
Yes.
Great. A little bit of hiccup to go. So thank you very much. Very happy to join you a little bit late from Brussels today, but here we are, here I am, and very sorry for not being able to be with you in person in Geneva. If we can move to slide number 2, please. So thank you for this opportunity to present the Critical Raw Materials Act, the CRM Act. So this is actually the first time that the EU proposes to set in EU law provisions to improve the functioning of the internal market by establishing a framework to ensure the Union's access to secure and sustainable supply of critical raw materials. We proposed it 16th of March, and negotiations with the co-legislators have kicked off at high speed, and we count on adoption before the European Parliament election in June next year. So the EU policy for raw materials that we have in place since 2008 already tackles the issue of access to raw materials in the EU, and this has helped to ensure a more secure supply. But if we take slide number 3, please. Today, we operate in a new environment. We live in a state of perma-crisis. The climate situation, the pandemic, the Russian aggression war against Ukraine cause a severe disruption of global supply chains as we knew them. This is the geopolitical context we live in, and this disruption needs to be addressed. We need to do more, and this is why we have proposed the CRM Act, part of the Commission's Green Deal industrial plan to achieve our green and digital transition. Slide number 4, please. At the core of the CRM regulation, of the proposed CRM regulation, are the benchmarks that we have in Article 1, and they give a clear direction of travel for our efforts on different stages of the strategic raw materials value chains, so that by 2030, Union capacities for the strategic raw materials have significantly grown. It is clear that we will continue to be needing to import an important part of the strategic raw materials we need, but we aim at diversifying our imports so that they don't come only from a very limited number of countries. For this, our benchmark for diversification is that we do not import more than 65% of our needs for a strategic raw material at any relevant stage of processing from a single third country. Strengthen all stages of the European CRM value chain is Chapter 3 in the regulation. So the idea is that strategic projects, it's a core instrument of the proposal, will be identified that produce strategic raw materials and contribute to reaching the benchmarks. They can be carried out in the EU and in other parts of the world. They need to meet the criteria in Article 5 that includes fulfilling sustainability requirements and add value in the third country concerned. To reach the benchmark for diversifying EU CRM imports and reduce strategic dependencies, the strategic projects are indeed key. Slide number 5, please. So the strategic projects, they need to demonstrate their sustainability. We propose that sustainability certification schemes may be recognized for this purpose. This can be found in Article 29. We set out criteria for certification schemes in Annex 4. And we are empowered to adopt implementing acts later on to provide further specification here. And when it is not a legal obligation in the CRM Act to certify the projects through a recognized scheme. It's also a possibility to demonstrate the sustainability referring to requirements for compliance with listed sustainability EU legislation and international instruments in Annex 3. Slide number 6, please. It's the second last. Diversification of EU imports will be achieved by deploying a comprehensive, sustainable, and fair international strategy. Therefore, the Commission will continue to negotiate bilateral strategic partnerships with reliable partners, develop sustainable trade and investment agreements, and deploy new diplomatic initiatives such as the Critical Raw Materials Club that you may have heard of, to secure resilient, affordable, and sufficiently diversified value chains for the EU. We require that the partner country of the Strategic Raw Materials Partnership meet key sustainability requirements. And the partnership is to contribute, as I mentioned earlier, to local value addition and be mutually beneficial for the partner country and the EU. The Critical Raw Materials Board that will be set up will ensure the cooperation with other international fora and initiatives relating to emerging markets and developing countries, including those set up by the Global Gateway Strategy. Last slide, please. So to conclude, I wanted to give a short overview of the CRM Act with a focus on the sustainability aspects and on the diversification of EU imports. So thank you very much for your attention. And for all of you who have contributed through to the proposal with your knowledge and your involvement, thank you very much for that, and very best wishes for a good continuation of the conference. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Maria, for joining us. For those of you who've been around the EU circles and around the conversations on CRMs, the Act obviously does not come magically. It has been informed by dialogue. It's been informed by Horizon projects. There's a lot of input, I wouldn't say compromise, collaboration that has gone into it. And of course, it is a European perspective. Now, first off, just in case anybody has any doubts after the 90 minutes are over, I am in favor of this Act, despite all the criticism that we might levy at it a little bit later on, because it is important for market signaling. For an institution and entity like the EU to send out clear market signals is important. But the question that we're going to be discussing within our panel today is, what does that market signal to the global South? We've seen graphs or variations of these graphs. We know for the green transition, the EU is heavily dependent on certain mineral imports. We also know for certain refined or smelted products, again, heavy dependency on external markets, and usually 1 or 2 or 3. And therefore, these are the minerals that make it the critical raw material list. We know that some of them come from friendly countries, such as the United States and Australia. We also know that some of them do not come from friendly countries such as Russia, or in certain cases where there's greater demand or there's already internal turmoil. So for example, South Africa, great friends, but the South African mining sector is also struggling with its own issues, and that may have impact on how the EU's raw material supply comes in. So that map tells a lot more stories than just saying we're dependent on 4 countries. It is also the domestic and the national ambitions of those 4 countries that will impact sustainable supply into the EU. So what is the CRMA? I'm going to mispronounce that at a certain point. Simple, addresses EU supply security needs. Let's be clear, EU supply security needs. The proposal does not say we're going to be addressing everybody else's supply needs, and that's fine. The EU has to be responsible for its own. They're looking at internal supply, because not in my backyard has now been accepted as not a policy that can keep on going as they go forward. We're not going to be talking about it, but the Act acknowledges not in my backyard thinking is no longer acceptable. This is happening with China, the US, South Korea, Japan. Everybody's got a critical raw material list. Everybody knows which countries these critical raw materials are at. So you are competing with global actors when you're going and addressing specific country issues. Then you have the acknowledgement that the EU will never be self-sufficient, et cetera, et cetera. Those are EU issues. What happens to the external partners? Anything whichever has the word Europe and club in it makes me slightly nervous always, because club just, it's like they went through a synonym thing and sort of said, what can be the least offensive word that we can find that will not scare people? Club, group, meeting, G20, whichever way you want to go, it is an acknowledgement of, yes, there are power imbalances in the world. There are power imbalances. There's nothing we can do about this. That is the reality of our world. But there is at least the idea of collective thinking about how we're going to address the issues that are going to come up. We're going to use trade agreements. This is becoming the norm. Almost all trade agreements have some environmental, social aspects to them. So there's codification and moving away from voluntary towards codification and having it. We're going to have a network of strategic partners. Yeah, is anybody in the room who needs a definition of strategic network partners? No, we've heard that phrase a number of times. We know who our strategic partners normally are. There's going to be a global gateway, which is the important bit, because the first time we're seeing promise of finance, we're seeing promise of financial flows, equity investment, debt investment to come with the demand for mineral supply. We are going to see, again, within the Critical Raw Materials Act, lower the risk of investment abroad. And anybody who's looked at a political risk map recently knows the risk assessments that are going around nationalization and everything else around minerals. There is a higher risk to either equity or loans, and therefore you need a greater institution to reduce the investment profile of this. And unfair trade practices. Unfair trade practices are people not following the same rules that you are, non-level playing field, and therefore doesn't make a difference to the cost of extraction or getting your, very simple, license. You need to get to operations. It can take a company that is following the rules 6 to 10 years to do it. A company that is not following the rules can go into construction within 3 years. That is an unfair playing practice. So what does this mean for the South? The EU is saying, we are not only going to look at extraction nodes, we are also going to look at value added and other beneficial nodes within that supply chain. What the EU is saying is we are going to help with regulatory frameworks and the capacity to enforce. Because if any of you have seen the environmental codes for a number of African and Latin American countries, great environmental codes, no capacity to monitor or enforce. We are going to look at industrial and economic benefits. Some of this language is old, but it is nice to actually see it put into the same act, which is talking about extracting supply. Here's the interesting bit. We are going to support and improve international standards. It's very nice because there aren't very many agreed international standards. We all kind of know what sustainability is, but I said, give me a responsible sourcing definition. There isn't, even the OECD doesn't have a definition of responsible sourcing. So what agreed international standards are, or where we've sort of said, yep, unless it's a UN or an ILO resolution, we do not have agreement on so many standards. Environmental, social protection, great. Climate and environment, great. And as one of our presentations will talk about, climate and environment are not always the highest priority for some countries. How do you acknowledge different priorities when it comes to your supplier countries? And currently, there are some partnerships already in the works between the EU, that is with Canada and Ukraine, and Kazakhstan and Namibia in recent years. So what does this mean for the Global South? These are the questions we are looking at as basically saying around ESG, around investment, what does the Critical Raw Materials Act, does it bring in something new? Or this is more of the same old, same old. So this presentation is way longer than I thought it was. There we go. Who are we doing this with? I have Akash, who is from Trafigura. And Akash is going to talk about the overall viewpoint of the commodity value chain, because Trafigura is involved in extraction, as in buying, supplying to people, following various ESG standards, following various international norms, finance. So he is talking about a viewpoint which looks at the entire value chain as it travels from the south to the north. Next, we have Alex. Alex is from Kumi Consulting. Kumi is normally around sustainability standards and certification. So he's a guy who talks about the reality on the ground, what really happens. Are these extraction points as sustainable as we're promising them? And looks at the supply chain and looks at client requirements as much as mining company and investment clients. Then we have Jean-Claude, who's over there. Just because I put him off stage does not mean he's not an important part of this team. Jean-Claude is the coordinator for AfricaMaval project. AfricaMaval project, Horizon funded, looks at establishing partnerships and research partnerships and actual finance partnerships between African and European players. Again, looking at sustainability within supply chains. They're still in the early part of their project. Then we have Lorena, who is from Chile, and she's talking about sustainable finance, and she's in the resources sector. And again, what those concepts mean when we're dealing with sustainability. Then we have Michael, who is also part of AfricaMaval, but here he's part of DMT, which is again a company from the industrial point, from the company private sector point, looking at extraction. What rules are you following? How's the refining going? What are your clients required? What else is going on? Then we have Zenze, who is seated at the end. She is Vice President, Africa Women in Mining Association, also involved within the oil and Namibian sector, and sort of is around natural resources. So she's kind of our African voice, which I know it's unfair getting an entire continent to just be spoken about by one woman. And not the least is Andy. Andy is our coordinator for the resourcing project. We are at the end of our project nearly, and resourcing project, again, Horizon funded, looked at what responsible sourcing means in different cultures and different contexts. So having done that, okay, let us get to the interesting part of this conversation. So we're going to do this in 3 batches. I'm going to consider 3 sets of questions. We're going to ask the Critical Raw Materials Act. What does it mean for operations and investments on the ground? Second part is going to look at what does this mean for sustainability standards, given there are a tremendous amount of sustainability standards already present. And then finally, what does this mean for the future and going forward? Zenze, as speaking on behalf of the entire African continent, my question to you is, the Act is very ambitious when it talks about ESG and sustainability standards and partnerships and value beneficiation. Do you think it drives or amplifies something that will make a difference on the ground in Namibia or other African countries?
Masima, am I on?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that question. Greetings to all of you from Namibia and Africa at large. But allow me to just say one thing. So this morning, it was the launch of the African Climate Action Summit in Nairobi, Kenya. And I found it quite interesting as I was listening to it. I said, the president just said everything I wanted to say at this forum here. But one of the things that he said, and this is in answer to your question, he said, right now, Africa holds the key to decarbonization. 2 years ago, I made a little clip in which I said all the minerals needed for the continued advances in technology and development are all found in African mineral reserves. Now, it's almost can I call it a prophetic act that these statements stand for, because having read the CRMA as thorough as I wanted to, all 94 pages thereof, I realized that what the Act wants to do, in answer to your question, and what President Russo said this morning, it just shows that we all have one common objective. And that is, we really want a better sustainable future for all of us. I love the statement that the previous speaker in the session said, at whose sort of advantage do we want to run everything we want to do. And the CRMA, I asked earlier, though it's not implemented, I like the fact that we are going around asking these kind of questions. There are places where you will go eek, but there are others where you think we're on the right track. So I'll leave it at that and you'll come back to me, wouldn't you?
I will.
Okay.
I will come back to you. Sort of moving to the Latin American, Chilean. Feel free to speak for the entire continent if you feel like. But Latin America is a slightly different entity than Africa, and that's because Latin America has two of the largest mining companies, Codelco and Vale, are Latin American born and bred. You have a number of Canadian, European, North American mining companies already present, and therefore they're already required high sustainability standards. And Latin America also has its own national ambitions for its own green transition.
Yes.
So, does this act in any way change the landscape or the context of within which Latin American extractives and the value chain, because there's beneficiation there as well?
Yeah.
Does this act change how Latin America would operate?
Well, first of all, of course, we have a different scenario. We are different continents, and exploitation starts first. We've been exploded since the 16th century, not the 18th or 19th century. So we have a little more experience in dealing with international cooperation. Latin America already has about 50% of the investments from foreign funding investment from Canada. About 20 companies from Canada exploit 85% of the reserves of diverse minerals in the Andean region, Los Andes region. One of those regions is my country, Chile. We are the first exporter in copper in the world. And we have the third most important reserves of lithium of the world. Lithium that is really critical for the energetic transitions. More than 65% of those reserves are in Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia. So we are also critical for the transition to the sustainable world. Our experience with foreign companies exploiting our resources is that they could have in their countries, in Canada, no one will ask which kind of standards could have Canada in terms of sustainability or environmental laws or procedures. But those standards are not respected in our region. Our region is a diverse region too. So we have diverse standards, environmental standards in each country. Maybe my country, since it is an OECD country, will have more strict regulation. But nevertheless, at present time, 20 of those Canadian companies are facing 22 trials in the Inter-American Human Rights Court because of human rights violations. So even though those companies would present themselves to the world as sustainable and as clean or green or whatever they can do, in our countries, they are not green. They do not respect not even our poor regulations. So I think this kind of norm that the European Union is trying to put in place could make a change for real, because allow us to have partnerships with other clients. We are present as partners for the first time in 500 years, which is a big improvement, I must say. And my country already signed one of those partnerships like 1.5 months ago. So I think that could change the scenario. We could start asking for something in return of. And I think that in my country, specifically in my country, that if you go for the whole numbers, we have an Human Development Index of 0.048, which is a higher Human Development Index, where the difference between the top 1 and the top 60% of the workers has difference of 600 times in terms of incomes. And the top 1, which has $2 million of income a year, will be related with natural resource extraction. So part of this new scenario is a challenge also for us as countries to really look forward this well-being for everyone, not just for the top 1%, not even just the top 1% of the world, which is obviously the North, the big North.
And that's an interesting, one of the things that you said on greenwashing, and we're so used to this about saying Canadian companies behave well in Canada. I've got nothing against the Canadians, just using them as an example. But they do not behave well when they're in other jurisdictions. And Michael, sort of coming to you, does the CM, the act, because there's a little bit more pressure, there's a little bit of a stick now, does this change for your own company, the risk profile that you're looking at? So when you're thinking about going into the global south, does the assessment of risk and opportunities change just because of what the EU is now going to push for?
Mazuma, I'm grateful you're answering this question. The CRM Act will help to reduce the risk and it will increase the opportunities. There's no doubt about that. Let me elaborate a little bit. Why does it reduce the risk? Well, first of all, there was a lot of speaking about the regulations. My company is supplying mining and exploration services to the world, literally to the biggest players. However, just to make it really clear, we support mining with principles. And we're so glad that the CRM Act has finally put these principles out there. We are completely following these principles. More than that, I'm actually, every single time I meet my colleague from the UN who's sitting in the back of this room, I ask him to please look over our shoulders and make sure that we are not even getting close to greenwashing. Not at all. For everything that we're developing, myself, I'm in charge for innovation for every innovative product or service that we're developing. The UN is looking over our shoulders. So we're not being pushed into this corner at all. How exactly does it help in terms of how exactly does it reduce the risk? Well, by putting these principles out there, they're called EU principles for sustainable raw materials. They were derived from the G7, G20 ESG criteria. Let's hold there for a second. G7, G20 ESG criteria. So that means that all the industrialized countries, the biggest players, they have finally settled on unique ESG criteria. That's great. I think that's a huge step forward. But let me tell you, it's extremely difficult to convince all the countries in this world to come onto one table. They will come to the table, no problem. But not all of them are happy to follow these G7, G20 ESG criteria. I'm sitting in ISO standardization boards, and I can tell you, we just submitted an ISO proposal for sustainable raw materials. I can tell you, I've done countless Q&A sessions. Countless Q&A to standardization institutes and organizations from around the world. They are very critical. I'm very happy to tell you that our ballot came out. 39 countries have contributed to this ballot. It's being supported by 20 countries from around the world. That's a great result, because it's an absolute majority. That means that gives you a momentary snapshot on where we stand in terms of regulation. We have convinced the absolute majority of the contributing countries. That's not bad. So basically this tells us we are not standing at the beginning. We have made extremely good progress and we are slowly convincing, but give us some more time. Convincing does take time because you need to talk to each other. People, there are big companies out there who are afraid that they will have to shut down tomorrow, right? You have to point out, no, your business model will not fail just by following these rules. There will be an advantage. And if I might just end on that one, the advantage by, for instance, by providing resources, commodities, according to these principles are, for instance, don't quote me on that, this is just an example, but resources who are meeting these principles, EU principles for sustainable raw materials, you can call them ESG criteria. The resources that are meeting these criteria will be imported into Europe and are likely to receive a certain benefit, such as, for instance, a tax benefit. Right. So the business. So if you also mentioned this. Somebody needs to make sure that these regulations are being monitored. Our mother company is an auditing company. Auditing is part of the process. Yes, you will have to audit, and one audit will cost 60,000, 80,000, possibly 150,000 if you include the consulting. But how much is that compared to the add-on to the tax benefit that you get on the next 300,000 tons of cobalt? I've followed the keynote lecture on CDART. Amazing what auditing could do to this part.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, but thank you for that. And I think the cobalt red conversation, the plenary was an interesting presentation about and conclusions that the author reached as compared to what other people would reach. But it brings me back to this idea of agreement on countries saying, okay, if you give us an agreed list of ESG, there is an ESG agreement that we can get to. And at this point, I'd like to bring in the resourcing project. Andy is going to talk about some of the findings from the resourcing project, because and I do not want to eat up his slides here. The resourcing project basically held conferences in Latin America, Africa, and China, and tried to find out if we have a globally agreed definition of sustainability or responsible sourcing. So I'm going to leave it up to Andy to share some of the findings from that research.
Everyone, we just heard a bit on the morning on very specific topics of cobalt, of what the environmental crises are. I would like to give a bit more broader glance about the topic of sustainability, responsible sourcing, and how relevant the systemic angle to it, of what different regions, different commodities have in common, but what are regional specificities to the Global South in particular. So we all know it, sustainability concerns in responsible sourcing up and down the supply chain, they are manifold. But there are also regional specificities, whether where they come from, whether they touch the economy, whether they touch human rights issues, and so on and so forth. There's different ways and different angles to address them, and there's different regions with different approaches to it. But that's kind of a bit of a broader glance on the topic. However, when we look into global mineral value chains, there's something what we call very systemic inherent challenges of what we need to deal with, whether we come from the Global South, whether we are based in Europe, the US, and so on. It's a lack of transparency due to the complexity of the value chains, due to the issues of business confidentiality that kind of backtrack on the transparency. It's a lack of empowerment of the most vulnerable and the rights holders, actually, who are exposed to the risks of what we call the local communities, the workers, environmental defenders, and very much marginalized groups. It's the fragmentation, the lack of collaboration, where we think, for example, the Act, the European Critical Raw Materials Act, might be a lever to actually facilitate this collaboration from a diplomacy point of view. And it's first and foremost, and it's been addressed in the keynote in the very morning, a lack of a level playing field of solutions, of economic players who show the way forward. There are some in the world already, but why do they haven't had a foothold, and why the economic transformation hasn't had taken place on a grander scale and not such a kind of minuscule scale? To briefly start, there is a portfolio of different problems, but we need to acknowledge where we are starting from. Just looking at the SDGs of what the different world regions have to cover with, of where they are trending right now. This is the point of where we start, of what the Act actually needs to look into when looking into strategic partnerships. And they are from environmental targets to poverty targets, to really getting the economy going, into moving also away from a minimalist development perspective, more into second and tertiary sector development. And just briefly looking into two of the major players, we furthered Latin America, Caribbean, as well as Africa as a whole, Sub-Saharan Africa maybe particular. What have we learned from resourcing and overall the global debates on responsible sourcing? What priorities do we need to take, pathways we need to take forward within these regions, and how the Act actually can help to actually facilitate these new directions? Very different, or somehow different priorities when we look at, for example, Africa, Latin America, Caribbean. When it comes to Africa, it's certainly the integration of goals when it comes to minerals development and human development and poverty eradication on the ground. It's changing the operating practices with regards to, for example, as we've seen in the morning, the artisanal mining sector, but also moving away from a purely extractive point of view in the economy. When we look into the Latin American, Caribbean, I've referred it as well, there are stricter environmental codes as well in place in these countries. Enforcement and cross-border pollution are issues. So countries working together and actually resolving these issues is a very important point. We know that human rights, land rights, human rights defenders are kind of treated as in a critical way. So this is definitely a topic we need to work on in this end. And also, I think these trade agreements or strategic partnerships coming from there maybe have a kind of a backtrack on when it comes to competition, maybe among Latin American countries, and how that actually resolves when the EU gets into country bilateral, EU as a whole, different member states with individual Latin American countries. This brings us also to different pathways for both of these major geopolitical regions. In particular, with regards to development, it's whatever we are engaging with from an extractive operations point of view, it's reflecting the needs of stakeholders and regional priorities in a development context, define who they are, and kind of measure them, calculate them into the action. And it's first and foremost as well for the African continent, look into the artisanal mining sector. And there are good practices that already working, the Mose-Oa-Tunya Declaration on ESM that has been implemented in some countries in Africa. It helped formalize and making a livelihood out of this practice and make it a more secure and more environmental safe practice for these people. For the Latin American continent, among many other actions and pathways forward, it's not only looking at the regional and local specificities of generating benefits from the extractive sector, but also looking at it from a macroeconomic point of view in decision-making, policy-making. What are the external externalities, the environmental one and social economic one, and how to factor that into policy making. And first and foremost, it's coordination, I think, and capacity building among and within Latin American countries to look into how to build up environmental requirements, how to kind of address transboundary environmental pollution from tailings, from mining legacies, and so on and so forth. So these are some of the pathways we're looking at and some of the avenues the Critical Raw Materials Act is taking for addressing them. What we see, what we have in common among different geopolitical regions is certainly that there is already solutions out there. It's the implementation of international mineral resource governance initiatives, such as standards, such as the ILO Tripartite Declaration of Human and Labor Rights, and to align them actually with the legal framework in terms of a reform in the individual member states on this end. Yeah, that's a bit of an outlook of what we are dealing with in these two major world regions and how the Act actually can complement on these actions. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. So one of the things that Andy also alluded to and what we were looking at the resourcing project was this entire conversation around support for climate and environment commitments. The Act itself has language which says active role to ensure EU principles and values. But most of this is language. So Alex, I want to ask you, since you're kind of closer to on the ground realities, these ambitions, how do you see them, these ESG standards and commonalities, how do you see them actually working on the ground in terms of compliance, reporting, evidence? Can it really be done? And does the CRM help or hinder an already complicated space for actors?
Yeah, hello everyone, also from my side. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, so actually, thank you, first of all, Masumo, for this question, because looking at due diligence and responsible sourcing in the CRMA, it's actually interesting. It doesn't figure so much in there. However, it figures at important sections, such as the strategic partnerships, the strategic projects, also for the recognition of standards, we have a section in there, etc. And of course, also very important, the alignment with other existing EU frameworks on responsible sourcing, maybe the conflict minerals regulation, the CSDDD, battery regulation, you name it. Having said that, you can definitely see among supply chain actors that due diligence, or that there is a raising awareness for these EU regulatory frameworks, for due diligence practices, etc. in general. Of course, more on the downstream side, because this is within the European context compared to the upstream side in the global south. You can definitely see front-running practices, etc., etc. However, overall, I think we still have to acknowledge that we are rather early in the process. Most of these EU regulatory frameworks are either just in force for, well, 2 years, like the conflict minerals regulation, or just upcoming actually, or within negotiations as the CRMA itself. So it may be a bit too early also in that sense to say to which extent they are actually resonating or interacting with the global south at this point. What is needed is simply implementation of these regulations. And maybe just one note on that, when it comes to the implementation, I think 2 aspects, at least from the top of my head, that I would like to emphasize. If we want these acts really to have an impact and to work in the global south, 2 very important aspects in this regard are, when it comes to due diligence, is collaboration, and the other one, process. So focus on collaboration and process, meaning due diligence is not just a compliance issue, and it's not just a tick boxing exercise in that sense, because it will not work. In the end, what you need is, in terms of collaboration, well, buzzwords would be responsible purchasing practices, long-term relationships, etc. in this regard. And when it comes to the process side, I think we also need to understand it's not just about collaboration, it's also a process of improvement. When we go to the global south, many of these standards and expectations that we have and that we put in the different regulatory frameworks, from environmental risks to social risks, well, the measures are not there, and it takes time. And if we simply go there and say, well, first we dictate to you, these are the expectations we have. Once you comply with them, then we will start to invest. Well, it's basically saying we want to help you develop, but you have to be developed in order to get the development, and that won't work. So yeah, from that perspective, again, it's a process of improvement, it's collaboration, and these are, I think, the most important aspects when it comes to the implementation of these regulations. And other than that, I think it's just, yeah, we need some time to see where this goes.
Implementation always seems the obvious answer, but it's also probably the most difficult thing to get done.
Yes.
in that. Akash, let me sort of bring you into this conversation, because Trafigura has been doing commodity trading for probably before I was born. But the idea of, because you have to deal with the global world.
Yeah.
The company is dealing with as much as the Chinese standards, European, American. And so you have been required to look at voluntary and legal requirements for a much longer period of time. Now, having the Critical Raw Materials Act come into this, are you seeing this as, okay, this is giving us another thing to push all players globally towards the same field, or this is now an added complication in your life?
Oh, thanks for that question, and I hope I'm audible as well. I think before answering that question, we need to first understand that this act is obviously meant for allowing companies to build resilient supply chains, as well as also ensuring that the local benefits are also reaped in the host and producing countries as well. Now, you also highlighted the competition. Everyone's having a different list of raw material, critical minerals and materials. So definitely we are going to see an increase in the competition. And at the same time, as the companies try to diversify their supply chains, we are looking at increasingly a seller's market. All these companies are going to operate in a seller's market, which is not the same as, in a different scenario when you are operating in a buyer's market. So you will have limited number of choices as receivers, and then you will have to ensure that you are working with them in a long-term relationship point of view. So that's something that's a critical message that we need to always keep that in mind while talking on this topic. Maria also highlighted at the beginning that there is an Annex 4, which describes the criteria for a certification scheme as well. Well, if you look at that, the criteria for evaluating these strategic projects are defined quite broadly at the moment. There's no specific reference to any particular standard. In this regard, I would say the situation is very similar to other, schemes that are already there. and other acts, such as German Supply Chain Act or Conflict Mineral or others, where companies are required to conduct some kind of due diligence and some kind of, and they are also allowed to choose their memberships and certification schemes, which in a way is not an apple to apple comparison. So for example, a company is promoting ICMM principles, but at the same time there's another automotive manufacturer who is promoting IRMA. Now the IRMA is like a gold member, and it requires a journey for a supplier to achieve that kind level of certification, and significant amount of time and money and investments as well, which I'm afraid to say there are hardly few mines in the world who have achieved that certification. So unless there is a standard that is defined, it becomes really difficult for companies to have these kind of conversation that, what is the exact requirement that we are looking for. So just to share some examples of how we are engaging and the nature of queries that we receive from our receivers. These days we are increasingly getting the number of questionnaires from our customers asking about what kind of due diligence has been done. Now, as a trend that we have seen is more or less the questions are similar on different topics of E, S, and G. At the same time, the questions are slightly different, but if you are looking for identifying the risk, they are more or less the same. Now, when we try to share our due diligence reports that we have already conducted, it already covers those topics. But then the customers are quite keen on, having their questionnaire answered, because, though it is a copper mark kind of certification, the questions are asked, but as per their code of conduct and policies, there are some additional questions. So now imagine the situation of a producer. If we start just sharing all these questionnaires down to the supplier, they will stop mining and producing. They will just start filling the questionnaires. So that's not helping. So that way we are trying to align our questionnaire along with all the industry certification schemes, so that, in one go, we can request information from supplier so that they can do what they are required to do. And at the same time, we can satisfy the queries of our customers so that they can, we can support them in the due diligence. Another point to also highlight in this part is, what, let's say, as we also talked about and we just discussed, is due diligence is a journey. It's just not a compliance or checkbox exercise. So even if you have conducted due diligence, what next after that? So in our conversations, with receivers, we also, when we share these kind of due diligence reports highlighting that, yes, some of the suppliers are good, some of the suppliers need improvement, and they are working on that. A simple example could be that, they have certain procedures and processes in place related to occupational health and safety, but they do not have a formal policy in place. And as a result, so we have though encouraged our supplier, and we have included those recommendations as well in the report, which is shared with customer. So customer is coming back and saying that, look, what is this? There is a risk involved, and they don't have a policy. So we have to also explain to them that, look, it's just don't look at what is being mentioned as a risk. You need to first understand what is the level of risk that we are talking about, and be also ready to cooperate and engage with them, because as I said, it's you have a limited number of options to deal with, and you have to work in a collaborative way. So I would say, so in this regard, again, we are trying to facilitate site visits. Some customers say that we don't want to buy this material because it is coming from DRC. We are happy with the material coming from Latin America. So it's like, look, whatever you are listening is one thing, but why don't you, if this is your own supply chain that you are looking at, we are proposing you, why don't you have a look on the ground, come with us. So we also took one of our customers to the site visit and showed them that this is your standards, this is how they are performing. Up to you, how do you want to evaluate? So I think these kind of measures would be required until we have a standard which is developed universally, and it is aligned with other certification schemes.
Michael, if I can ask you to quickly come or respond to what Akash has said, because I'm guessing you guys have exactly the same problem with the number of questionnaires and the ISO standards, and it's nice that there's agreement there. But do you think that part of the EU's, and a lot of people have done this, they've left the definition of sustainability open? because they say that's the better way of sustainable practices rather than going down a checklist approach. So responding to what Akash has just said, and this idea of keeping it open is better than closing that definition?
It depends on what you would like to keep open. From what we learned is, and I warmly recommend to read warmly recommend to read the latest BGR report, who have done a comparison of sustainability standards. They came up with a nice synergy. They've even done a benchmarking. They found that, I don't want to go into much detail here, they found that there are only 5 large standards out there who are not even covering the full supply chain. They're all covering the upstream part. Some of it, a little bit of refining. Copper Mark is a brilliant example, or Aluminum Stewardship Initiative. But when it comes to mining all the other mineral raw materials, downstream is barely covered. Yeah. So this is, so we need to find one unique sustainability standards. Yes, there will have to be cross recognition, because you cannot just cross out all the other standards just by putting an ISO standard out there. But this is feasible, this is doable, this has been done before. But, and let me rephrase that again. It's one thing to put an ISO standard out there. It's a totally different thing to put to bring every single country on board and have every single country accept that. And but this is why I think the CRM Act is so brilliant, because the logical next step of such a regulation, being legally mandatory or not, is a standard. And here comes the next step. A standard needs to be audited, needs to be monitored. So an audit, right? So the key, don't underestimate the element of auditing. You get a once-off certificate, you get an initial certification, and then this needs to be monitored on a 12, 24 months basis, right? This will add a little extra cost, but this is how you keep how you keep this in place. This is how you get a picture. We have barely started this. Yeah, we've done a pilot project. This is where we stand. But as I mentioned before, out of 39 countries, 20 yeses. So we are making progress. You will be surprised who approved our proposal. I may just single out one single country. China likes our idea. Mm-hmm. They are supporting the EU principles for sustainable raw materials. Who would have guessed that?
I mean, the Chinese aren't that bad. Let's just talk about contra. Okay. But I like that idea, and I'm going to come to you, Zenze, because there's a certain unpacking these things is always important, right? Because what Akasha and Michael to an extent are talking about is companies, right? Then you've got governments, and then national governments have regional governments, and then there's a whole plethora of things that happens, and especially with SADC and trading blocks, there's another, again, generation of thing. When we were having this panel conversation, one question that came up, but who's defining critical minerals? You know, who's critical for whom? Mm-hmm. I'm going to slightly change that question and say, who's defining the questionnaire? These questionnaires and these standards and these audits that we're filling, who's defining the questionnaires? Because that goes to this conversation around greenwashing and whatever. So then there are 2 questions for you. One, when it comes to sustainability and operations and monitoring, what is the role of the African governments? Are they even being considered in this part of the conversation? And then what about Africa's own viewpoints on sustainability? Is it your questionnaire, or is it somebody else's ESG questionnaire that you're being asked to address?
Yeah. So you must give me one at a time, okay?
Let's start with governments.
Okay. So I'm not even sure I'm going to touch that question, but I'm going to answer it as best I can. The fact that we are having this conversation literally at the same time here in Geneva, that's happening in Nairobi, and I'm sure elsewhere else, is the fact that we are really having this conversation. Okay, that's the one thing. The second thing is listening to all of this and having been part of AfricaMaval for the past year, traveling across Africa, looking at various regulatory frameworks. I also get the feeling that when we're saying who's designing the questionnaire, we need to ask where exactly is the questionnaire coming from? And allow me to elaborate. Having watched the presentation by the author of Cobalt Red, I was sitting and listening, talking to Johanna next to me, and I say, That type of mining you will not see in Namibia. So first of all, what I'm trying to get at is, when we responded the same way in Cape Town when somebody asked us, yeah, but what about corruption and what about this kind of pollution? When I feel like almost like we have to rank, and that's what's happening. We are ranking the dare I say, complexity of this ESG, CRMA, and all of those kind of things. We are taking each other to task. We know for a fact that that type of, they are called attitude to mining is unacceptable. But we also know that that's what they have to do to feed their children. How are we helping each other? At what point does Africans lean on each other to help each other before we can even look at the outside world, global north, as they're termed nowadays? And it's very important, Masuma and my colleagues here, that you should know, for one, that we are having this conversation. We are taking each other to task about it. And we have institutions such as, Joanna, help me here, Young Earth Scientists of Africa. We have young people who are very interested in where Africa is going to. So when we have these kind of conversations, I feel like we need to have them on board as well. I am part of the youth. But you understand what I'm saying? So we shouldn't sort of making it just a behind closed doors conversation with just specific leaders. Africa is known as we've got the youngest population. And together with South America, knowing that the thing that is sitting with us, I believe we have to have the conversations with each other. Those, so what are they called? Questionnaires that are being designed. I wonder, and I have to ask it back, are you having the Global South on board when you design these questionnaires? It's the same as, AWIMA stands for African Women in Mining in Africa, but when we're having a very basic example, and it's probably not related to this, but when we talk about maternity leave in the mining industry, I find it hilarious that the ones who write those policies are men. At the same time, when you're talking about CRMA, what you want to do in the Global South and all of that, those who will be affected by this, are you having us on board to talk about? And I guess that's what's going to happen with the Intergovernmental Forum on Thursday. Just a bit from my side.
Yeah, but that brings me to an important question about sort of the word partnerships, strategic partnerships, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to have people on board. And we thought this is a time for our second presentation for this panel, which is from AfricaMaval. And I'd like to invite Jean-Claude to come and share the ideas. The AfricaMaval project, again, funded by the Horizon funding, is looking at creating partnerships. And so the question I put to Jean-Claude for his presentation was basically this: what are the challenges of partnerships? We like using that word, throwing that word around, but how easy or difficult is it to actually form partnerships around mineral supply chains and value chains? So to you, Jean-Claude.
Thank you very much. So there is several partner of AfricaMaval here in the room. So Zenzi and Michael, you have said it, but also Eberhard from Intro, and also Shahzad and Robin from WRF. So the partnership is partly represented here. And in fact, establishing a partnership was not the biggest deal. So that took us, 1 year to prepare the project. So I've been working a lot with Zenzi, so she knows very well. But in fact, it was also the discussion with the European Commission, because even if he's born before, AfricaMaval is a baby of the CRM Act, because it was a prototype somehow in terms of how we can act in order to create real added value in foreign countries and getting metals for the European industry, and make it honestly and with the confidence of our African partners. And so we didn't choose the easiest because AVIMA, the Association of Women in Mining in Africa, so it's a strong team. And when they decided to join the team, so it was really a trial, I was in front of all the team and they asked me so many questions that it was difficult. But finally, they joined. And in fact, even if it has been presented by Maria and after by Matsuma, I wanted just to put some point about this CRM Act, because in fact, it's in close relation with what we do, in fact, in AfricaMaval. So AfricaMaval is focusing only on Africa. So it's not global south, it's only Africa. But in Africa, you have 54 countries, so you still have some job to do. And also, AfricaMaval is a very practical project because we use all the work which has been done in resourcing, the job done in terms of criteria and global view, which is done by DMT and Michael especially, and so on. But what we want is to have a job in Africa before the end of the project. And in fact, my personal target is to have a practical project next year already, even if the project is just 1 year, it has been launched 1 year ago. So if you look at the CRM Act, so it's to say that the international trade is a key for EU, but the idea is to create a critical raw material club. So you know that the EU is signing agreement with different countries. So in Africa, actually, it's only Namibia. But tomorrow it could be DRC, Zambia, or other countries, and it could be 6 months or next month. But in fact, in AfricaMaval, we are looking at the global continent. So we follow for sure what is done by Brussels, but and we launch AfricaMaval in Namibia. It was not. It was clearly with the EU. But also we want to work everywhere in Africa, and not only in the people selected by the Commission. So using these trade agreements, it will be useful. The roadmap, which has been taking some time to be done in Namibia, include a lot of our inputs. In fact, to continue. We want to make a strategic partnership. That means we are not just there to make a coup, open a mine and go away, or also having a lot of criticism, but anyhow we'll get the metal, so that is important. So we are not a trader. We are there, in fact, to establish partnership on a long-term basis. And some partners of AfricaMaval are partners with us since more than 20 years. And so the level of confidence, I think, that we get through this long-term partnership with other projects, such as PanAfGeo, which is a project which is ongoing for training of African experts in the field of geosciences, makes that we can develop partnership on a long term. And so if we succeed in continuing to get this confidence level, so we hope that we'll have a sustainable dimension, and I will speak about it later on. Using the global gateway is important, even if it's not so clear for me about what is the global gateway practically. But anyhow, it's a way to reformulate, I would say, a lot of action of the EU, and especially in the infrastructure, which is the target of AfricaMaval. So here it's too complex to be fully explained, but I don't know if there is a, yeah. Oh, it's funny. But so you see it's numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So in fact, we want to get information about the whole continent. So we want to see the potential in terms of CRM. So we speak about eCRM because it's the extended CRM list, because it's not the list only of the EU, but we put also nickel, copper, and so on, which are not in the list of the EU, or manganese or tin, but which are key for some countries in Africa. So we extend the list and we use eCRM. So we look at the potential. we look also with DMT about the value chain. We look at the financial instruments. So for geoscientific, as me from the French Geological Survey, we are far away from our normal field of comfort, and it's people coming from the city, even if there are not so many English. But and after we have the ESG condition, and that is managed by Zenzi as a project manager for Avima in our project. So it's something that we obtain in our project is that our African partner are work package leader, which is not something which is so easy. We have project where the consortium has to be European. Here in this project, our African partner are work package leader, and the ESG work package is the biggest of the project, and it's managed by Zenzi. The second one is the number 5. It's creating a platform between EU and Africa. So in fact, it's connected with the platform from ERMA, the European Raw Material Alliance. But this platform is developed by MADI, which is a Mineral African Development Institution based in Uganda, but spread out in Africa. And it's also a non-profit organization from Africa, Avima being an NGO. And after, so we look at the strategical aspect with the 80 raw material. And after, what we want is to together establish a label of AfricaMaval of proposal of projects that we will after try to finance. So it could be financed by the member of ERMA. You know, ERMA, it's more than 150 enterprise with Airbus, with Stellantis, with BMW, and so on, and they invest in projects. You have also all the mining company European, such as Boliden or Eramet, but also Vale, which is not so much European, but anyhow, also member of ERMA. So we want to be able to invest with them, and for the large-scale mining and operation, it's important. But we want also to develop more social aspect, and so Avima would be very sensible to that. So we are looking at ISM projects, but for CRM. We are looking also on recycling aspect, and also with WRF, especially. And so we are looking at all these projects, and so we will validate it, and we will also try to get after the financing. So finally, yeah, it's I didn't write it for today. It's a presentation of the project, and you found the same keyword, in fact, and in the CRM Act. Sustainable business network, best practice in terms of ESG, and we will write it also, and we'll do some training in Africa together with Avima and WRF, and also as we will look at all the value chain from the mining, the mineral processing, the refining, but also to the end product. So we want to have a big overview, a global overview about it, because it's a decision-making tool which is very useful. And once again, the DMT is in charge of that. And after, as I told you, we are very practical. We want to invest in Africa and to create jobs and opportunities. That's it.
Thank you very much, Juan-Claude. Now, that presentation had the word responsible investments, and we've sort of been skirting around sustainability finance, and that's part of what the Act is promising, finance and equity participation. Lorena, as far as I'm aware, sustainable finance is a great term, but there isn't much of it around. There's no actual green finance apart from the whole greenwashing thing. Do you think having more green finance available, chasing projects that don't exist, it's just either going to crowd out private sector investment, or it's just going to inflate the price of sustainable projects without actually increasing the number of projects that exist? Because if there's one sustainable project and there are 5 investors after it, you're not actually expanding sustainable mineral supply. You're just overinflating the value of one particular project.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's more or less depending on how we face it. In my experience, well, I come from science. Then I'm one of the, I don't think there are much of us in finance that can deal with the scientific language of the environment and the finance language. So if I put myself on the funding area, I can tell you that from funding area, it's difficult to deal and to understand the difference between green, deep green, light green, painted green, okay? Because on the funding point of view, if you tell me this is good for the environment and I don't have data and I don't have the language, and we have a lot of lists of things that I can see have, no have, having, not having, and putting like, and selecting and making a good due diligence, it will be really difficult to do it. So that's why I told you, for us as Latin American country, there is also a challenge, which is, as you say, in Africa, we need first of all to talk in between us, to improve and increase our capabilities, to deliver the proper information. And if we do so, we have a huge deal of investment portfolio that could be interest. It is really interesting what you can do when you have the proper scientific data and the capabilities on the other side that can present in the proper language what we want to do or not to do with the investment. So if we could be able to do that, I think that these critical raw materials that are critical for Europe, but are strategic for us, could really be the leverage we need to fill the gap for development. You know, we've been developing countries for a whole lot of years. So it's okay to to fill the gap and to improve the level of life of our population. So I think it's a good opportunity to have investment portfolios instead of one sustainable project. And that is on us. Maybe part of this partnership could be helping us to improve our capabilities, to increase our data centers, and maybe use technology to provide the information the funding sector needs. I developed in my country during 2019 some funding, some financial instruments to improve renewables investment in order to increase the renewable percentage on the population by 60%. The first challenge was to convince our Ministry of Finance that those people really exist in the country. And the second was using the data that we had available at the moment, which was not much data. But after that, that finance model was used to change our debt. So right now, 28% of the debt of Chile is based on sustainable projects, which was not at the time. And it's been 4 years. It's not 10 years, not 20 years. So having the right data, I think, could be the point.
And I think that this question about having an investment portfolio, and Akash, I want to again take you to the global perspective. We kind of know what the European viewpoint on it this is, right? But almost every major economic power has announced a critical raw material strategy. Do you think they're all on the same page, or is this again going to be money chasing fewer projects? Because we also have the supply forecast, which is simply saying supply, whether you're talking copper or lithium, we do not have enough projects in the pipeline. So again, is investment and then sustainable investment, Akash, do you think that's going to help with supply come online, or is this just one more variable in an already complicated supply model?
Well, you asked about the carrot and stick approach. So in the previous question, so it's like I would say this is one of the instrument of, I would say it's a carrot rather than a stick or kind of another situation. But more importantly, yes, there is definitely a need of investments and partnerships to ensure that the local value is also delivered to to the host country. And I think having these kind of partnerships as global gateway or mineral security partnership or things like that, raw material club, they will certainly act as an enabler for to create an ecosystem for public and private partners to fuel the investments which are required to develop the project. I think there are means from Trafigura's perspective, I can already talk about the Lobito Corridor project in Angola, which is helping the three countries to connect to establish a rail network to market the goods and products to the western route. Similarly, we are also having a partnership with Germany as a preferred supplier to provide the critical minerals for next few years. So I think that there are projects like these, and more projects will come in the future as well to support funding for required for developing the infrastructure and overall. But at the same time, if we look at the ESG angle to this, I would say that though we did talk about the standards and how they are not aligned and there are different variety and things like that, but one thing is clear that the demand for these standards will definitely going to increase. The requirement for these kind of information will definitely increase in the future. Be it whether these companies are located in Europe or in China or in UAE or in US as well. They may not have same kind of ambition, but they would have similar kind of requirements around ESG. So it's definitely there that all the requirements around sustainability is going to increase in the future. And just to also share in terms of some of the examples, like we also get a lot of queries from our buyers that they want to buy those materials with whom along with we can share some level of information. So it's like 1 ton of material, here is 1 ton of information for you to share. So the preference is going, the trend is going in that direction. So as long as we are able to share the due diligence information, it makes us easy for us to sell. At the same time, there is another driver associated with that is the sustainable finance angle. So these days, all investors and financiers are being compelled to think on the lines of, how green is your current portfolio? Is it green enough? Are you considering, ESG criteria while funding these, supply chains or not? And that's something which we do come across. So from Trafigura perspective, again, we have certain sustainability linked loans for few years. And one of them from responsible sourcing side is also that we want to align our management system and our responsible sourcing program with ISO 20400. But keeping that aside, so after realizing how that mechanism works for a couple of years, we have now early this year initiated a pilot program in Mexico, saying that how we can use this program for our suppliers and in the supply chain. So the idea behind that is with the help of with our financiers, we get access to cheaper finance on the condition that the condition is tied to the performance of our suppliers in Mexico. So if they are able to improve their performance on voluntary principles on securities and human rights, the benefit that we get from through access to cheaper finance is passed on to the supplier. So that gives some kind of motivation to supplier as well, that yes, if I have to perform, so I can get some kind of financial benefits as well. And there is also a security in terms of contractual agreement that yes, I am in a relationship with Trafigura for a few years as well. So I think instruments like this would certainly help if we have these kind of partnerships as well, and more drivers coming from different stakeholder groups as well. So
which kind of, Alex, it makes me feel like Kumi Consulting is going to be in business for a very long time, given the amount of certification and verification that seems to be accompanying all of this, whether it's ISO certification or whether it's suppliers, clients asking for. Is there are we sort of creating jobs for ourselves? I mean, this push for validation and the certification and this need, is there, I hate to think that sustainability reports are about to become fatter, and instead of 80 pages, one will have to read through 180 pages. Is this actually useful?
I think you're just hitting a very important point that I also tried to actually kind of mention in my previous comment. So on the one hand, yes, due diligence, compliance, etc., it has its role and it is important. But in itself, if it becomes a mere kind of tick box exercise in terms of verification, auditing, etc., it is insufficient to really drive change in that sense. This is my personal opinion. This is also the opinion we strongly have at Kumi, where we simply say auditing, compliance, reporting, etc., needs to be accompanied with or by meaningful engagement with the supply chain actors. Again, responsible purchasing, cost sharing, etc., etc. So other practices in order to make it actually meaningful in this sense. Actually, there is not much more from my side to be said at this point.
That is helpful. Okay, I'm sure we all want cakes and coffee by now, so I'm going to start wrapping this up. Lorena.
Yeah, I wanted to add to you. You know, when I evaluated credit, I used to rate international loans for countries in Latin America a couple of years ago. Do you know how many days I had to rate the project? Green, light green, paint green, this rate? 2 days. So if we are going from 80 pages reports to 200 pages report, I had time to review 12 pages, not 80, and go through the information for a really small amount of time. So I think for our countries that are used to receive the diligence list, like this standard plus this one, plus this one, plus this one. And then you tend to have the list and then the checkpoints, and then see if you check all the cases or not. It will go to information, standardization, and then how we collaborate. Yeah. We construct, it's a co-construction for me. Yeah. In between countries, we are equal. For us, it's strategic. For Europe and for maybe United States, other countries, will be critical materials. But for everyone, it's a strategy. Mm-hmm. We need to leave our current model that because we are transiting to sustainability from this way of producing and doing economics and finance, which is in the past, you know. We are not changing the way we are doing the things. We are changing why we are doing it. Because we want to transit to sustainability, but we are extracting the same way that we've been extracting for hundreds of years.
No, fair enough.
Maybe if I just can add something also a bit in that adds to this also in defense of the due diligence schemes, because often then it seems to be, well, due diligence schemes is just about certification and auditing, but actually what we also see from our clients a lot is the schemes do have a much larger role than that. They can support in capacity building. They can actually collective leverage on the supply chain, knowledge exchange, etc., etc. So they actually have a very important role, and this is also something actually which we try to bring in with our clients in this regard. Yeah.
If I just may add a sentence on the auditing and certification. We have to be clear on what auditing and certification is. It's not a tick box exercise. The secret, not sure how many of you know this, but the art lies in the audit catalog, right? You design the question so that, and here comes the magic, so that you can hold the company if it doesn't comply, so that you can hold them responsible. Right, this is the art in the audit catalog. Every standard has a different audit catalog. I'm not sure if they all have. Our standard certainly does have, because my mother company has done this for 100 years. They know exactly how to design audit catalogs so that you can really have an angle on the one if there is non-compliancy. right? And I think this is where the progress lies, right? So you can go back to the mining operator and say, look, you didn't perform very well on this particular E or S or G issue. We give you half a year to improve, and then this person will be re-audited. It's also part of the process. So I just want to avoid the misunderstanding, a tick box exercise. It's not.
Then, since you're the only one left who hasn't said something, do you want to come in and then we can wrap this up?
Then we can wrap it up. You know, like I said in the beginning, we're all saying the same thing, perhaps over or under each other. We've been mining for years, whether it is artisanally or whether it is commercially. We know that. And we also know that what's in the reserves in these global south, north, is what is needed right now, okay? But what is, I think, very important is get to know us. Get to know your customers or your whichever suppliers, get to know us, and then maybe accordingly rate, because it's always confusing. It blows my mind when we have discussions such as these. Many years later. The one thing, though, I have to add is just maybe briefly, in Africa, what I found, having traveled across these countries doing the AfricaMaval project, is that there's a very big trust issue, mistrusting. So everybody will be like, so what does the EU want? You know, are they here to say they're going to shut our operations down? Then EU is saying, yeah, but we want to give you money, but these are our conditions. And really, the only way you can find that middle ground is through discussions such as this. And I'll end it at that.
Thank you. I'm going to let you guys stalk these people during coffee for questions and answers, because we could use it. But here's an interesting idea. And I was thinking about how to sum up this panel, and I said, oh, what happens if I take out the term CRMA? The conversation that we are having are conversations some of us have had for a very long time. It needs to be a dialogue, not a single kind of thing. Finance needs to take care of what it's doing. There are international standards. There's too much of a jumble, auditing, et cetera, et cetera. I think the brilliance of the CRM is that it brings it all under the same 80-page directive or regulation. Conversations that have been partitioned, whether they were talking about how companies need to behave, and we haven't addressed country regulations and trade agreements because we haven't seen any yet. But the CRMA brings in government responsibility, which has been missing from IRMA standards, from ICMM principles, the copper mark, where the governments are left off free. The act brings the governments back in. And then it finally actually promises finance. It actually says money has to have a role to play. This cannot be empty words and empty conversations. And we know every time money gets involved, conversations become a little bit more interesting, shall we say. I would like to thank my lovely panel for bringing together ideas on a very diverse topic, especially since we were so many of us trying to get our points across. A quick hand for our panel, please. So Sherzad and Robin, who helped organize this, are in the back somewhere. Thank you for doing this. My suggestion would be in about 4 years. Oh yeah, let's give them a clap. My suggestion, Sherzad, would be let's come back 6 years from now when this act is already done. And one of the questions I want answered at that point is there one questionnaire? Instead of 5 million, have we agreed on one questionnaire? Have we agreed on one reporting due diligence or audit standard? And hopefully have somebody from China sitting here and saying, European standards are shit, ours are better. Let's see if that happens. But it would be an interesting to see these European values now that they are codified. It's about having that 80-page document. Does having it codified in one document, is that what was needed to push through the multiple conversations that we've been having? Right. Thank you very much for your indulgence.